In August 1944, German generals observed the American advance sowing near the Seine. They concluded that the U.S. forces had reached their limit. Fuel shortages, overextended supply lines, and heavy equipment seemed certain to halt the offensive. To them, the sight of endless truck convoys crawling across France was proof of inefficiency, not strength, a symbol of how the Americans fought without discipline or plan. But the movement they mocked soon revealed its purpose. From the beaches of Normandy to the front, the roads filled with an unbroken stream of engines, each carrying fuel, ammunition, or rations. The convoys ran day and night, guided by strict schedules and marked routes. Drivers fought exhaustion and weather to keep a single rule: never stop. What appeared chaotic from above was, in truth, a system built on precision and endurance. As German commanders waited for the Allied thrust to stall, they discovered instead an enemy that did not pause. The same trucks they had dismissed as folly were now driving a continuous advance across France. How did a network of ordinary vehicles become the power that broke open a continent? The answer began on those roads. By mid-July 1944, Normandy was secured but strained. Behind the Allied front, fields once filled with shell craters now served as supply yards and repair zones. Every shell, ration, and gallon of fuel still had to move from the beaches through narrow, damaged roads. Victory on the coast had created a new problem inland, an army advancing faster than its logistics could follow. The German High Command expected this. Their railways lay in ruins, but they believed time would serve them. Without functioning ports or intact bridges, they reasoned, the Allies would soon halt for lack of supplies. The Wehrmacht's analysts wrote that the Anglo-American armies could fight brilliantly but not feed themselves. To them, the Allied success in Normandy was tactical, not sustainable. The Allied leaders knew otherwise. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's staff calculated that every division required 700 tons of material per day. General George S. Patton's Third Army consumed far more. In early August, his tanks stood idle for want of fuel. At one airfield, fighter units were grounded so gasoline could be siphoned into trucks for the front. The war had turned into a contest of logistics. Traditional supply routes were collapsing. The rail network across France remained unusable, and new pipelines were months from completion. Eisenhower's headquarters searched for an emergency measure. The order came from the communications zone under General John C.H. Lee. Use motor transport continuously without interruption. Every truck, regardless of its assigned unit, would be placed under a single command. The plan was simple in concept, impossible in scale. From the depots at Cherbourg and Saint-Lô, thousands of vehicles would run a one-way circuit to the front, then return empty on a parallel route. Military police would control traffic. Engineers would repair bridges. Maintenance crews would work along the roadsides. There would be no stops, no diversions, and no delay. Many officers doubted it could work. British staff questioned how a system so vast could be coordinated. Even within the U.S. command, skepticism lingered. But necessity removed choice. Eisenhower's final order was brief. The convoys would roll at all hours, regardless of danger or fatigue. Priority was absolute. Fuel first, ammunition second, food third. While German reconnaissance reported Allied units pausing to reorganize, the truth was different. Night after night, lines of trucks began to snake eastward under blackout rules, their tarpaulins glinting faintly in the moonlight. To the Luftwaffe pilots flying above, the headlights were invisible. Only the low vibration of engines carried through the dark. Those convoys were the beginning of a new kind of warfare, not an assault with guns or tanks, but one of coordination, fuel, and will. As Europe burned and armies maneuvered, a system unlike any before it took form, one that would turn the simple truck into the most decisive weapon of the Allied advance. In late July 1944, the Allied breakthrough at Saint-Lô shattered the German front in Normandy. Operation Cobra turned static lines into open country, and within days the Wehrmacht was in retreat. But the speed that brought victory now created a silent crisis. Every armored division burned fuel faster than the supply columns could deliver. For Patton's Third Army, success on the map meant trucks running dry on the road. Each American corps required hundreds of thousands of gallons daily. Ammunition, rations, and spare parts had to cross bomb-damaged bridges and cratered roads. Railways were destroyed, ports were unusable, and depots near the beaches overflowed with undelivered cargo. Soldiers joked grimly that, "We've beaten the Germans, but not the distance." Commanders knew the offensive could die as quickly as it began, not from combat, but from emptiness in the tanks. At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower's staff searched for an emergency remedy. On August 25th, after days of debate, General John C. H. Lee of the Communications Zone proposed a bold solution, a continuous highway of supply trucks operating without pause. Borrowing a term from American railroads, he called it Red Ball, an express route given absolute priority. No civilian, no staff car, no other unit would interfere. The plan stretched nearly 700 kilometers from the ports of Cherbourg to forward depots near Reims. 2 separate highways would serve one-way traffic, one outbound with supplies, and one returning empty. Military police would manage intersections, engineers would repair bridges, and fuel points would be spaced every 80 kilometers. The objective was clear: keep Patton moving. Orders went out to all available motor transport units. Thousands of GMC CKW trucks and 6-ton models were recalled from depots and construction sites. Within days, 6,000 vehicles stood ready. Most drivers came from African American transportation companies, men who had been trained for labor, not combat, but now carried the fate of the campaign. Their mission was exact: drive, deliver, return, repeat. The first convoys rolled out before dawn on August 25th. Engines roared through mist and exhaust. Each truck carried 5 tons of cargo, fuel drums, shells, food, or medical crates stacked under tarpaulins. The route markers, red circles painted on white boards, lined the highways like beacons. From the air, the columns looked endless, stretching from Normandy to the Seine like a metallic river. Discipline was absolute. Convoys traveled in groups spaced 15 minutes apart. Drivers were forbidden to stop for rest, food, or sleep except at designated control points. Military police checked schedules, and any delay required written justification. The success of the system depended on rhythm, movement without pause. Each truck, regardless of its driver, became a link in a single chain. German intelligence misread what they saw. Reconnaissance pilots reported long, slow-moving traffic lines and assumed they were disorganized retreats. In Berlin, the High Command concluded the Allies were overextended and short on fuel. They failed to see that these convoys were the answer to that very weakness, a mobile pipeline moving across France. As the weeks advanced, the scale grew. Fuel consumption at the front doubled, yet deliveries kept pace. The Red Ball Express carried ammunition for artillery, food for 500,000 men, and spare parts for tanks that had outdriven their supply depots. At its height, the system delivered more than 12,000 tons daily. Commanders who once doubted it now called it the road that feeds victory. The men behind the wheels saw it differently. They faced exhaustion, mechanical failure, and constant risk. Roads were narrow, shoulders soft, and bridges weak. They drove through rain and dust, often under blackout, guided only by the dim outline of the truck ahead. When engines failed, drivers repaired them with wire and ration tins. They called themselves the Army behind the Army. Civilian life continued around them. French towns watched the convoys thunder through day and night. Farmers stopped work to wave. In Paris, crowds gathered along boulevards to see the endless line of trucks, each marked with a red circle. To civilians, it was a sign that liberation was real, that the front was alive and moving east. By the first week of September, the Red Ball Express had achieved what planners thought impossible. Patton's tanks crossed the Moselle, supply levels remained stable. The offensive continued. The Germans, expecting a pause, found no respite. Their lines collapsed faster than their staff could draw new ones. The trucks had become as decisive as any weapon. The success, however, came at immense cost. Engines overheated, tires shredded, and drivers averaged only 3 hours of sleep. Maintenance units worked beside the roads under floodlights, salvaging wrecks to keep others running. Fuel consumed by the trucks themselves reached 1/10 of what they carried, but it was still more efficient than stopping. Every mile was a victory of endurance. In 3 weeks, a new kind of front had formed, not of soldiers and guns, but of motion and organization. It was warfare measured in distance rather than territory. The Red Ball Express had turned supply into strategy, speed into strength, and labor into momentum. From Cherbourg to the German frontier, the rhythm of its engines became the pulse of Allied power. By the time autumn arrived, even the skeptics understood. The American advance had not stalled, and the Germans had lost their bet. The convoys that once drew laughter now commanded respect. The Red Ball Express, built from necessity, had given the Allies something rare in war, an unbroken line of progress. By the end of August 1944, the Red Ball Express had become a permanent fixture on the roads of France. From Cherbourg to the Seine, the air vibrated with the constant rhythm of engines. Every few minutes, new convoys joined the flow, marked by red circular signs that signaled priority passage. What began as an improvised lifeline had turned into a moving supply network, alive, loud, and relentless. At full strength, more than 6,000 trucks carried everything the armies consumed. Each day, roughly 12,000 tons of cargo rolled east: gasoline, ammunition, food, spare parts, and medical supplies. The system was divided into timed convoys, one departing every 75 seconds. To outsiders, it looked chaotic, yet every movement was logged, scheduled, and enforced by the Transportation Corps and the military police. The drivers, many in their early 20s, came from across the United States. 3 out of 4 were African American soldiers assigned to segregated transport units. They worked 20-hour shifts through exhaustion, rain, and darkness. Each convoy was bound by one rule: never stop. Rest areas were rare, and food often meant cold rations eaten behind the wheel. For most, fatigue was as dangerous as enemy fire. The trucks themselves, mostly GMC CCCWs, became symbols of endurance. Mechanics called them jimmies. They operated far beyond their limits, loaded with fuel drums that leaked fumes through the tarpaulins. The roads were unpaved, narrow, and treacherous. Engines overheated on hills, brakes failed on descents, and dust from summer heat filled the lungs of every man behind the wheel. Yet, despite the strain, the convoys moved, day after day, without interruption. The first serious test came in early September when heavy rains swept northern France. Mud replaced dust, and roads turned into rivers of sludge. Tires spun helplessly, axles cracked, and wrecked vehicles blocked the lanes. Maintenance crews followed the convoys, pulling damaged trucks aside with winches to keep traffic flowing. Mechanics often worked knee-deep in mud, scavenging parts from wrecks to repair others. Efficiency depended on speed. Hesitation meant collapse. German air power, though diminished, still posed a threat. Low-flying fighters occasionally strafed convoys, especially at dawn or dusk. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on half-tracks or towed vehicles to protect the roads. Drivers were ordered to keep formation even under attack. More often, the danger came from within: fatigue, collisions, and mechanical failure. Every day, dozens of trucks were lost to accidents. Their cargo burned beside the road, glowing against the dark countryside. Despite constant danger, morale remained high. The drivers took pride in their mission. Many painted names on their trucks: Rolling Thunder, No Stop Express, or Hitler's Gasman. The convoys formed their own identity, bonded by hardship and humor. They developed hand signals for communication and learned to navigate by instinct when maps failed. Even in exhaustion, they understood the value of their work. Traffic control became a discipline of its own. Military police operated 24 hours a day at intersections, bridges, and checkpoints. Using flashlights, flares, and colored paddles, they directed convoys with precision. The slightest mistake could cause miles of blockage. To maintain order, the route was divided into zones, each under a traffic commander who reported hourly to the communications zone. The entire system functioned like a living machine. To civilians, the sight was unforgettable. In towns along the route, French residents lined the roads to watch the endless columns pass. Children waved at the drivers. Some offered apples or bread. The convoys became symbols of liberation, proof that the war was moving eastward. In Paris, liberated only weeks before, the Red Ball trucks thundered through boulevards toward the front, greeted with applause. Yet the drivers had no time to stop. Orders forbade unnecessary halts. Every minute saved meant another kilometer gained at the front. For the German command, the scale of the operation remained unclear. Intelligence reports described constant traffic behind Allied lines, but its purpose was underestimated. Field Marshal Walter Model dismissed the convoys as wasteful American improvisation. He assumed that an army so dependent on gasoline could not sustain its speed for long. The reality was the opposite. Gasoline was the reason the Allies could advance faster than the Germans could retreat. As September progressed, the Express reached its peak. In one 24-hour period, it delivered nearly 16,000 tons of supplies, a record unmatched by any land-based transport system in history. Patton's Third Army alone consumed over half of that volume. His tanks crossed the Moselle River while the trucks roared behind them, carrying the fuel that made the maneuver possible. The Wehrmacht had no equivalent. Their railways were shattered, their depots empty. Logistics had turned into a weapon. The work was punishing. Engines burned out, tires disintegrated, and drivers slept in short bursts beside their vehicles. Accidents were common. Collisions in darkness sometimes wiped out entire convoys. Yet the supply totals continued to rise. Military engineers repaired roads and bridges faster than they were destroyed. When one bridge over the Seine collapsed under the weight of a convoy, it was rebuilt within 48 hours using salvaged steel. The system adapted faster than it failed. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express had become a subject of legend within the Allied ranks. Frontline soldiers spoke of it as the unseen army. Commanders praised its discipline. Newspapers called it a miracle of logistics. For the men who lived it, it was routine. Endless miles, constant motion, and the smell of gasoline in their clothes. Their courage lay in repetition, in the act of never stopping. The human toll grew as the miles accumulated. Drivers worked until they could no longer focus, then swapped positions with the passenger to rest briefly. Sleep came in 10-minute intervals on vibrating seats. Some lost control and crashed. Others died from exhaustion at the wheel. Each loss was replaced by another driver, another truck. The system demanded continuity above all. Rain returned in late September, followed by fog and cold. The routes grew longer as the front pushed toward the German border. The trucks now traveled through Belgium and Luxembourg, often within range of enemy artillery. Bridges were mined, and road shoulders were lined with wrecks. Still, the convoys moved. At night, the horizon flickered with muzzle flashes as the drivers passed close to the fighting. By October, over 23,000 men were assigned to the operation. The trucks consumed enormous quantities of their own cargo. 1 in every 10 gallons of gasoline went to fuel the convoys themselves. Yet efficiency remained high. Commanders accepted the trade, better to burn fuel than lose momentum. Eisenhower's headquarters declared the Red Ball Express an essential element of victory. Losses mounted. Official records show over 4,000 trucks destroyed or permanently disabled. Maintenance units salvaged what they could, creating makeshift fleets of hybrid vehicles assembled from spare parts. Despite shortages, no convoy ever failed to reach its destination. The Army Transportation Corps later calculated that 95% of all scheduled deliveries arrived on time, an unprecedented rate for field operations. The noise of the Express never stopped. Day or night, the rumble of engines and the grind of gears echoed through the countryside. Soldiers at the front learned to recognize the sound long before they saw the trucks. To them, it meant supplies, fuel, and the promise of movement. The Red Ball Express became the audible proof that the war still advanced. By early November, the convoys had carried more than 300,000 tons of cargo. German resistance west of the Rhine had collapsed. The Allied advance that many had predicted would stall had instead accelerated. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht could not rebuild its defensive line. The logistical momentum had broken their strategy. As the campaign neared the German frontier, the Express began to slow. Railways in France were repaired, and new pipelines reached the forward depots. The trucks that had once defined the Allied advance were gradually reassigned to other routes: White Ball, Green Diamond, and XYZ. Yet their work remained visible in the roads they had carved and the speed they had made possible. When the Red Ball Express officially ended in November 1944, it had already reshaped the way armies moved. It had proven that logistics could operate at the same tempo as combat. Its success turned supply from an afterthought into a central strategy. From that moment on, every modern army would measure its strength, not only by its weapons, but by its ability to keep them moving. The laughter of the German generals had long fallen silent. What they had dismissed as reckless improvisation had instead become the instrument of their defeat. The roads they ignored became the arteries of Allied victory, carrying fuel, food, and endurance across a continent in flames. The Red Ball Express had turned motion itself into a weapon, and it never stopped until the war moved beyond its reach. By late October 1944, the sound of the Red Ball Express still rolled through France. For 3 months, the convoys had kept the Allied armies in motion, carrying more than 400,000 tons of supplies. Every ton of fuel, every shell, and every meal at the front had come by truck. What began as a desperate experiment had become the artery of victory, but at a cost no chart could fully measure. The machinery strained beyond endurance. Trucks built for short hauls now ran 20 hours a day on roads that destroyed them. Engines overheated, tires shredded, and axles cracked. Mechanics turned wrecked vehicles into sources of spare parts, stripping one to keep another alive. Every piece of steel was recycled. Every bolt mattered. The men behind the wheels endured the same punishment: fatigue, hunger, and the constant vibration of the road. Many drivers slept in their trucks between runs, leaning against steering wheels slick with oil. Accidents were common. Convoys collided in darkness, overturned on wet slopes, or burned when fuel drums exploded. Statistics show that more men died from crashes and exhaustion than from enemy fire. Yet replacements kept arriving, drawn from other units to fill the gaps. The mission was absolute. The front could not stop. Among those drivers were thousands of African American soldiers who had carried the burden of the Express since its first day. They faced the same risks, but little recognition. Segregated camps and mess halls reminded them that even success had limits. Still, their discipline and endurance kept the operation alive. When other units faltered, their companies maintained the schedule. Without them, the Red Ball Express would have broken long before the frontier was reached. At the front, the results were undeniable. Patton's Third Army crossed the Moselle and advanced toward the Saar. German formations that tried to regroup found themselves outmaneuvered by speed. Reports from the Wehrmacht staff described enemy columns that moved faster than we can report them. Logistics had become the new form of warfare. The Allies could attack wherever their trucks could reach. But victory created new strains. Every kilometer gained stretched the line farther. Fuel consumption soared, and convoys traveled longer routes through worsening weather. By November, snow and fog slowed the roads to a crawl. Some bridges collapsed under weight and vibration, forcing engineers to rebuild them overnight. The drivers pressed on, headlights covered, their engines echoing through valleys lit by distant artillery fire. Even success demanded sacrifice. The same trucks that had carried freedom across France began to wear out faster than they could be repaired. Engines failed mid-route, leaving convoys to tow their fallen vehicles aside. Mechanics worked by torchlight in freezing rain, their hands numb from cold metal. Supplies still arrived at the front, but each ton now cost more fuel, more labor, and more lives. Eisenhower's staff recognized that the operation had reached its limit. New pipelines, known as Pluto extensions, were delivering fuel directly from the coast, and repaired French railways began to take over heavy transport. The Express had fulfilled its mission. Gradually, the convoys were reduced, their routes absorbed into newer systems called White Ball, Green Diamond, and XYZ. But no later network would match the speed or scale of the original. For the Germans, its effect was devastating. Their intelligence reports in November described the Allies as an army with no pause. Attempts to bomb the routes failed. Raids destroyed individual trucks, but never the system. Field Marshal von Rundstedt concluded that American logistics are the decisive weapon. His army, once famed for organization, was now defeated by its own doctrine turned against it. The human toll behind that success remained hidden in the daily reports. Each driver covered more than 1,500 kilometers per week. Many collapsed from exhaustion after their shifts. Dozens were buried along the route, marked by simple wooden crosses near the roadside. They had no medals or ceremonies, only the knowledge that their work kept the armies moving. Their war was measured not in battles, but in miles. By mid-November, the Red Ball Express had delivered more than 80% of all gasoline used by Allied ground forces during the advance across France. It had supplied entire corps faster than rail transport could have managed. In less than 3 months, it had made the impossible routine, an army in constant motion, living from the road. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ceased operations. The roads it carved through France remained etched into the land. Muddy scars turned into paved routes that still bore traces of tire marks decades later. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps described the mission as a success of necessity. That phrase captured its truth. Born from crisis, sustained by endurance, ended only when its work was done. Its story did not end with its closure. The organization it created, the scheduling, route control, and mobile repair methods, became the blueprint for post-war logistics. Its lessons shaped future campaigns in Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf. The Red Ball Express proved that speed, discipline, and supply could equal any weapon in shaping modern war. For the men who had driven those trucks, the silence afterward felt unreal. They had lived to the sound of engines, horns, and shouted orders. Now the roads were quiet, lined with autumn leaves. Many returned to other duties without recognition, their contribution buried under the noise of later victories. But commanders like Eisenhower and Patton understood. They knew that without the Express, the Allied advance might have stalled in the fields of Normandy. The convoys had turned logistics into combat and drivers into soldiers of supply. They fought not with guns but with endurance, against fatigue, weather, and distance. Their victory was measured in movement, their courage in persistence. The Red Ball Express had changed how wars were fought and how victory was sustained. The German generals who once laughed at the long lines of American trucks were forced to admit their mistake. The same columns they mocked had carried the strength that broke their army apart. The front had advanced not only by strategy or firepower, but by motion, by the men who never stopped driving until the war passed beyond them. When the last convoys of the Red Ball Express halted in November 1944, the roads of France were already changing. The red circular signs came down, and the endless columns of trucks gave way to railway engines and pipelines. What had begun as an emergency measure had accomplished its purpose. The Allied armies stood at the German frontier, supplied, organized, and unstoppable. The operation closed without ceremony. Maintenance units reclaimed their vehicles, mechanics stripped damaged trucks for parts, and traffic posts were dismantled. Yet the roads themselves remained, rebuilt bridges, widened lanes, and depots that would later serve as military bases and post-war transport corridors. The Red Ball Express had left behind more than worn asphalt. It had drawn a blueprint for how modern armies moved. In just under 3 months, the convoys had delivered more than 412,000 tons of material. They proved that mechanized transport could sustain an advancing army across a continent. The achievement marked a new stage in warfare, logistics as strategy. From then on, no modern campaign would separate planning from supply. The lessons learned on those roads reshaped every major operation that followed. Behind the figures stood the men who made it work. 3 out of 4 drivers were African American soldiers serving in segregated transport units. They operated under the same danger and exhaustion as combat troops, but often without recognition. Their discipline ensured that the flow of supplies never failed. In later years, commanders acknowledged their effort as a turning point in the U.S. Army's understanding of service, equality, and professionalism. The experience of the Red Ball Express also transformed military doctrine. The principle of rolling supply, convoys running continuously rather than by fixed schedules, became standard practice. maintenance, and repair systems were redesigned to travel with the front. Fuel logistics evolved from storage to mobility. These concepts formed the basis of NATO's post-war logistics and every major U.S. deployment for decades to come. For the French population, the convoys symbolized renewal. Roads cleared by engineers became lifelines of reconstruction. Towns that had once watched Allied trucks roar through later rebuilt their markets and industries along those same routes. The bridges the Americans reinforced outlasted the war, carrying commerce and travelers long after the soldiers had gone. A machine built for battle had quietly become the foundation of peace. In the records of the U.S. Army, the Red Ball Express was classified as a logistical success. To the men who drove it, it was something more, a test of will that measured endurance rather than heroism. Their courage lay in repetition, in hours spent behind the wheel through rain, fire, and fatigue. They fought a different kind of battle, one measured not in victories, but in miles. When Allied troops finally crossed the Rhine in early 1945, they did so with the confidence earned from months of unbroken supply. The Red Ball Express had proven that fuel and organization could achieve what tactics alone could not. The laughter that once greeted the sight of those American truck columns had turned into silence, the silence of an army that understood what had defeated it. Its legacy outlasted the war. Military historians would later call it the campaign that moved victory. Roads that once echoed with engines became highways of reconstruction, and the men who had kept them running carried their experience into a new era of logistics and civil transport. What began as a short-term improvisation ended as a permanent lesson in power, precision, and endurance. The Red Ball Express stood as proof that modern warfare was not only decided by guns or courage, but by motion, the ability to sustain movement when everything else stopped. On those French roads, the Allies learned that victory traveled not on tracks or maps, but on wheels that never ceased to turn. When the Red Ball Express shut down in mid-November 1944, its drivers dispersed quietly across Europe. The roads they had conquered turned cold under early snow. France was liberated, but the war was not finished. Ahead lay the forests of the Ardennes, a place where supply lines would again decide survival. The success of the Express had carried the Allied armies to the German border, yet it also revealed a truth. Even the strongest machine could be stretched to its limit. Winter would soon test that limit. In the coming months, the same highways that had fueled victory would face a different kind of battle, one against cold, exhaustion, and a desperate enemy striking back. In December, as the snow deepened and fog rolled across Belgium, the Wehrmacht prepared its final counteroffensive. The Allied armies would once again depend on trucks, fuel, and endurance to withstand the storm. The roads of France had proven that speed could break an army. The snows of the Ardennes would show whether supply could survive one last assault. The Red Ball Express had ended, but its spirit would continue through every driver, every engine, and every road that carried the Allies toward Germany and the war's closing act. The Red Ball Express operated from August 25th to November 16, 1944. Created under the U.S. Army's communications zone, it supplied Allied forces advancing after the Normandy breakout. The route extended nearly 700 kilometers from the ports of Cherbourg and Saint-Lô to depots near Reims and Verdun. 2 one-way highways were marked with red circular signs for exclusive convoy use. At its peak, the Express employed more than 23,000 men and over 6,000 trucks, primarily GMC CCKW 2.5-ton models and heavier 6-ton variants. Approximately 75% of the personnel were African American soldiers from segregated transportation companies. Convoys operated 24 hours a day, moving one truck every 75 seconds. Drivers worked in rotating shifts that often exceeded 20 hours, enduring fatigue, weather, and mechanical hazards. Each vehicle carried up to 5 tons of cargo, mostly gasoline, ammunition, rations, and repair parts. On average, the system delivered 12,000 tons of supplies daily, with records surpassing 16,000. During its 82 days of operation, the Red Ball Express transported an estimated 412,000 tons of material, sustaining Patton's Third Army and other Allied formations as they crossed France. Losses were severe. Roughly 150 trucks per day were damaged or destroyed through overuse, accidents, or enemy fire. Nevertheless, more than 90% of scheduled deliveries arrived on time. The efficiency of the operation exceeded all previous logistical records in modern warfare. The Red Ball Express ended when repaired railways and new fuel pipelines replaced its function. Its structure and methods, route control, convoy priority, and mobile repair units became permanent standards in post-war military logistics. Historians later described it as a campaign of motion, proving that in industrial war, endurance and organization could be as decisive as any weapon. The roads of France that once echoed with the sound of its engines became peacetime highways. Yet, beneath the asphalt, remained the memory of a force that had carried an army across a continent, one truck, one driver, and 1 mile at a time.